I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff Tabelko. I have the good fortune of directing our environmental change and security program and chairing today's session, one that we've entitled Integrated Analysis for Development and Security Policymakers, Scarcity and Climate Population Natural Resources. A title that only one's mother, so to speak, could love, because certainly I got lots of pushback from anybody who in our communication side, but in some ways reflecting the fact of the challenge that we have before us, which is how do we get out of our stovepipes to deal with all these issues. We felt we had to put all the issues on the invitation so that everyone in those stovepipes could come and learn about integration and how we tackle them together. So hence the laundry list. That at least gets us in the room, and then if we can come up with a more pithy enunciation of these issues, then we will gladly take those suggestions and use them in the future. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all for this discussion. When I had the good fortune yesterday to be on a panel with Alex Evans up in New York at the time when I found out, I said, Alex, any chance that we could have you come down to Washington and share some of your insights on integration? And he said, sure, and I'm going to see Matt Burrows in a couple hours. How about we have him join as well? And which I enthusiastically endorsed, and he successfully made happen. So it's terrific that we have two people, in some ways, kind of transatlantic perspectives, working on integration from in government and closely working with government to try to understand how this kind of basket of global issues work together, don't work together, certainly are integrated, connected, and how we develop integrated analysis and integrated response to deal with them. And so we have two gentlemen who've thought a lot about that, done some of that themselves in a variety of formats, but all with very much a practitioner, policymaker audience in mind for that work. And so we're pleased to see the kind of diverse group of said practitioners and analysts and researchers in the room so that you can share your insights as well and hear from these gentlemen. Before I turn the floor over to Alex, just a word about kind of where we're sitting. A lot of familiar faces, so ask for your forgiveness for hearing this again. But the Wilson Center, as I think many of you know, is the formal memorial to Wilson, and the living memorial that reflects his legacy of scholar and politician, and the only president to have a PhD. So Congress thought it better to set up a living memorial rather than an obelisk on the mall that we would go get our pictures taken in front of. And so we do this nonpartisan, non-advocacy dialogue facilitation and trying to facilitate scholarship specifically under the Environmental Change and Security Program, looking at these different topics, and we've done so since 1994, with many of you in the room contributing all along the way in those discussions. We're fortunate to have support from a number of sources, but quite notably USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health that make a number of these meetings, including today's, possible. So we thank them, and it's terrific that so many folks from AID are able to join us as well. Finally, before a quick intro of our speakers, just mention that we're broadcasting today's event live on the web, and then we'll have the video archive. What that really means for us is only when it comes to the Q&A that we ask that you use a microphone so that folks online can hear the entire discussion as well. So Alex is going to kick us off. He's based in the UK, but his primary affiliation is the Center for International Cooperation at NYU, that, as I'm sure many of you know, does a lot of work for and with the UN, works very closely there. He heads the program on climate change, resource scarcity, and multilateralism. He's also writer, editor of Global Dashboard, so you can get his insights in the short blog form or the longer paper form, and in a variety of different outputs. Very prolific, very focused on these integrated topics, with a lot of work that has both supported various UN efforts as well as DFID in some of the UK-based bilateral efforts. Matt Burrows, again, is somebody who's very familiar to us, comes from the NIC, is counselor at the National Intelligence Council, is also director of the analysis and production staff. I think this is his second tour in that role. And quite notably has, among other things, overseen and primary author on the most recent Global Trends 2025, Transform World, the intelligence community's kind of really standard-bearing effort to bring these issues together and have practical advice for policy folks. And we have a variety of veterans from that process. It's great to see Ellen Lapes in here as well. Matt has really grappled with this in very practical ways and had to put down in a quite comprehensive document what the intelligence community and really a kind of whole of government perspective is on understanding these integrated issues and looking out forward a couple decades hence and understanding how these drivers are going to really impact where we're going. So we're eager to have his insights on how we do this and how it's done and the issues as well. So I will shut up and turn it over to Alex and welcome him to the center.
Thanks, Jeff. And it's great to be here. Well, let me kick off with why we should be worried about scarcity issues in the first place. And the obvious contextual point to start with is that people are wanting to consume more stuff across the board, and particularly more energy, water, and food. So population is rising, of course. We have an expanding global middle class, shifting to Western diets, consuming more energy. And the net result of this is that demand for oil is rising by a percentage point every year. Demand for water is going to go up by about 32% between now and 2025. And then the real biggie, demand for food will be up by 50% by 2030, according to the World Bank. Now, none of this would be a problem if supply growth were able to just keep pace with demand growth. But unfortunately, there's increasing signs that that may not be the case. If you look at oil, for example, the International Energy Agency has been patiently warning for the last few years that investment in new oil production is nowhere near enough to meet projected demand, and that the stage is set for a new energy supply crunch as soon as the global economy starts to pick up again. In the background, of course, there's the point that the age of easy oil is over, with remaining reserves in either politically unstable or geographically hard to reach places. And in the background, the whole question of when global oil production is going to peak. On food, meanwhile, the productivity gains of the Green Revolution in the second half of the 20th century have been running out of steam for some years now. Back in 1970, we were averaging 2% productivity growth every year. But now we're down to 1%, and it's still declining. So in 2008, as we know, we had a food price spike. The number of undernourished people globally went up by 150 million people to over 1 billion for the first time. And now, of course, right this minute, we're seeing a renewed bout of volatility, with wheat prices having doubled over a 6-week period, and just yesterday, a food price riot in Maputo in Mozambique that left 6 people dead. On water, of course, we know that surface and groundwater extraction is already unsustainable in many parts of the world. And on top of that, when you look at climate change, reduced water availability is one of the first sets of impacts, one of the earliest things that's going to happen under climate change. And then there's land, finally, where demand is increasing both globally, where we're seeing increasing competition between different demands for land like food, feed for meat, biofuels, fiber, that's paper and timber, cities, carbon sequestration, and so on. And we're seeing competition for land in kind of local and regional hotspots, where you have the combination of land degradation and desertification and rapid population growth and weak systems of land tenure, and now increasingly this trend towards land grabs. And all of this is before we even consider climate change. And as I mentioned, water availability reducing will be one of the main near-term impacts. Reduced crop yields is another one in low latitudes to begin with, and in all latitudes once you look more than 10 years out or so. The thing about climate change is it makes life more difficult on all the other resource scarcity issues that I touched on. It makes water availability fall. It makes crop yields fall. It demands huge changes in energy production, of course, because we have to make our energy systems low carbon. And we have to make equivalent changes in agriculture, which, if you count deforestation, accounts for up to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's before we consider extreme weather and all the other shocks and stresses that will come with climate change. So that's the kind of the big five: land, energy, food, water, and climate change. But why should we see them as a set? Why think of them collectively as scarcity issues rather than as 5 single issues? And I think there's 5 key reasons why. The first we've touched on is that they share common drivers. The imbalance I touched on between supply and demand. The fact that we've been chronically underinvesting in developing new technologies and sources of supply. The whole issue of path dependency that makes it difficult and expensive to shift to more sustainable technologies. And of course, the consistent failure to develop policy frameworks. That's one reason why to think of them as a set. Another one is that in the real world, of course, there are feedback loops that connect these issues together. Take a situation like Haiti, where you can see obvious feedback loops between deforestation through to soil loss and erosion, through to degradation of agricultural land, changed precipitation patterns, increased risk of flooding, reduced food security, and so on. The real world does not respect the boundaries that we perceive between these issues. And of course, once you get to regional and global levels, the importance of those feedback loops only increases. Now that leads on to the third reason why I think we have to see these issues as a set, because these feedback loops mean there's tremendous risk of displacing problems from one aspect of scarcity to another. So take the Green Revolution. It achieved extraordinary things in improving food security, but we're just realizing now that it's often done so at the expense of water security or of energy security, because agriculture became so much more dependent on fossil fuels in the process. And this risk of displacing aspects of scarcity from one to another also creates the risk of unintended consequences. And the obvious case in point is corn-based ethanol, where a measure designed to improve US energy security had the accidental consequence of greatly diminishing global food security. And then two other reasons why I think it makes sense to see these issues as a set. One, of course, is the vulnerability point, that poor people in fragile states across the board are the ones who are most vulnerable to these issues. Poor people typically spend 50 to 80% of household income on food, making them particularly vulnerable to food price spikes. We know, of course, that climate change is going to impact hardest on low-income countries. We know that ecological shocks, are often a big driver of what makes people poor in the first place or makes it so difficult to escape poverty. But I should also say on the vulnerability point that, of course, it's not only poor people and poor countries who are vulnerable, that as the world has become interdependent and reduced the kind of resilience, the buffer systems in the global economy, so we've all become vulnerable to volatility in the global economy. And then I think the last reason why it makes sense to think of scarcity issues as a set is because scarcity comes with interesting behavioral dynamics. If you think of a run on a bank, that's one example of the sort of behavioral dynamics that arise when people perceive scarcity. Or another example is where you have a panic in a situation where there's a fire and the fire exit isn't big enough to let everybody out. You see similar dynamics where there's a perception of scarcity in the international trade context. Look at the way 30-plus countries slapped export restrictions on their exports of food in 2008. Again, it's perceptions of scarcity driving irrational behaviors. It's fertile ground for panic, and we need to factor that into our policy making. So that's a really quick overview of scarcity issues and why I think it makes sense to think of them as a set. Well, what do we need to do about them? This is an incredibly broad question. We could talk about it all day, but let me try and cluster it into four broad areas, which I think sets out the beginnings of an international agenda for action on these. Start with what we need to be doing in developing countries, and particularly in fragile states, where I just want to pick up on three particularly important sets of actions. One is the whole area of governance of renewable natural resources. Now, over the last decade, when international aid donors have thought about governance, they've often thought about relatively technical areas like public financial management, anti-corruption commissions, all in the executive branch of government. I think increasingly we'll see the governance agenda in development being much more about renewable natural resources like land and fisheries and water and forests. Who owns them? Who gets to use them? And so on. And the acute political controversies we've seen over so-called land grabs is a taste of what's to come. And if you want to see just how acute those concerns can get, well, look at Madagascar, where a South Korean company was on the point of agreeing a lease with the government to lease one half of the country's arable land for 100 years. And when news of the deal broke in the Financial Times, it led to popular discontent simmering over and was widely seen as one of the contributing factors to the coup d'etat that happened there. So I think that these issues of scarcity could prompt the international development community towards perhaps a more political approach to governance, a less technical approach. A second set of issues we need to look at in developing countries is a sort of what I call the resilience toolkit. I think if you look at areas of international development practice that are really innovative and exciting at the moment, you notice a lot of them are about reducing vulnerability and managing risk and promoting resilience. Think of areas like social protection, climate adaptation, peace building, disaster risk reduction. They're all about reducing risk. Now, what I think we've barely begun to get into is exploring the synergies between these areas. Nick Stern, who wrote the Stern Review on climate change, made the point that social protection is climate adaptation. International Alert, a leading peace-building NGO, has made the point that climate adaptation is peace-building. So you start to see the way that we could start to really explore the overlaps and synergies between these areas of development practice and potentially bring resilience much more to the heart of our approach to international development especially as we start putting together the post-2015 agenda beyond the Millennium Development Goals. The third and last issue I just wanted to touch on in the country context is the question of population. Now, population growth is slowing globally. We're actually on track to stabilize at around 10 billion people in the year 2200. But the remaining population growth that there is very heavily concentrated in low-income countries, many of them fragile. Countries like Ethiopia and Pakistan can expect to see a doubling of their populations over the next 40 years or so. Now, population's become a difficult issue to talk about. Lots of people think when you raise the issue of population, you're about to suggest a one-child policy or something equivalently draconian. But I think it's the opposite that's the case. This is all about empowering women. We know what reduces population growth. It's things like access to girls' education, access to reproductive health services. But we need to really scale up our level of ambition on those issues. So that's the first of my 4 kind of clusters of actions. That's the stuff in country. The second one is all about the money, the financing requirements. And let me start with agriculture, where we have to admit we basically forgot, we, the international development community, forgot about agriculture for 2 decades. If you go back to 1980, about 20% of the global aid budget went to agriculture. But by the time we got to 2006, we were spending just 3% on agriculture. Over the same period, we'd halved the amount of public money going on agricultural research and development. So now we've got a lot of lost ground that we need to make up very quickly. We need to have a 21st century green revolution that doesn't just produce more food, but does it more sustainably, less water use, less reliance on fertilizer, less energy dependence, and that does it more resiliently as well, because it's going to have to cope with climate change. The amounts of money we're talking about, well, the UN's estimate on that is potentially $40 billion a year on agriculture. Now, that would be 1/3 of the total global aid budget now. So it's a big ask, but we've started to make steps in the right direction. The G8 pledged $20 billion over 3 years, so we're moving in the right direction, but there's a lot more to do. And remember that agriculture is also where we're going to win or lose the battle on water scarcity, because agriculture accounts for 70% of human water use. Now, once you turn to energy and climate change, well, you're looking at sums of money an order of magnitude higher. The International Energy Agency thinks that to meet global energy demand by 2030, the price tag is $26 trillion in 2008 dollars. Now, if at the same time you want to stabilize global warming by limiting parts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to 450 parts per million, you have to add another 10 billion onto that price tag right there. And again, actual investment far, far below these levels. And that's before we even touch on the existing financial needs, like finance for development to meet the Millennium Development Goals or humanitarian assistance needs. And I think what this brings us to is 2 big questions in the financing context. One, what is the overall price tag for development in a world of scarcity? In practice, lots of these areas are going to overlap. Rural development, climate adaptation, doing a 21st century green revolution, lots of this is the same money that we're talking about. But we haven't really explored those overlaps so that we can start to come up with an overall sense of how much money are we talking about. And then, of course, the other question is, where is that money going to come from? I mean, OECD governments largely feeling the pinch at the moment, struggling to maintain existing aid budgets, much less scale them up to deal with climate and scarcity. Non-OECD governments, well, they'll invest to meet their own needs, for instance, in resource access deals, but there's no obvious queue of emerging economies waiting to finance the low-carbon economy. So the assumption a lot of people are making at the moment is that the private sector will finance the needs of adapting to a world of scarcity. But the blockage to that, to realizing that objective of private sector funds meeting these goals, is that there's a massive lack of investor certainty. Investors aren't sure if governments mean what they say about, for instance, moving to a low-carbon economy. So they're hedging, they're holding back, and governments need to get much better at sending, if you like, signals from the future, creating a strong sense that we really are going to move to a low-carbon economy so that investors start to invest in that anticipation and you get to a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's the financing part. The third cluster of actions is all about trade, and this one I find especially fascinating. What we saw in 2008 in the agricultural context was basically a generalized loss of confidence in open international trade as a way of meeting countries' commodity needs. We had, as I mentioned, 30-plus countries with export restrictions in place. And the underlying theme was this sort of tip from 10 or 20 years where disputes in the trade context had been about market access to suddenly those disputes being about security of supply, being about the opposite. And the effect of that was that the World Trade Organization was largely left on the sidelines during the food price spike. It just wasn't built to mediate disputes over security of supply. So what do we need to do about this? Well, again, I think two sets of actions. One is we need to make trade more resilient. In NAFTA, in the North American Free Trade Agreement, there are rules against sudden export restrictions. We don't have those in the WTO. Maybe that's one thing we should be looking at. Maybe we should be looking at a multilateral food reserve or a system of regional stocks alternatively. In the energy context, perhaps we should be looking at bringing emerging economies into full membership of the International Energy Agency, which is, after all, at its heart, an emergency coordination mechanism for dealing with oil price spikes. And above all, we need to clarify our emergency procedures for dealing with food price spikes and export restrictions. What happened last time was basically that the UN Secretary General was having to phone up heads of government and plead with them not to implement export restrictions. That is not a robust system for dealing with this kind of volatility. Over the longer term in the trade context, we really need to improve our understanding of the kind of long-term drivers of change from the scarcity context that are going to shape the future of international trade. And I'm thinking particularly here of the long-term outlook on peak oil. We really have no idea at this point of how that's going to affect trade volumes in the future. We're beginning to assemble the data. The OECD, for example, has a maritime transport costs database, which shows how relatively small increases in fuel costs can massively increase the cost of grain in import-dependent countries. But we need to do a lot more of that research and make the data transparent. And then the fourth and final cluster of actions, I think, is in the area of conflict prevention and managing strategic resource competition. I think it's important to make the point that the conflict risks that arise from scarcity are mostly within countries rather than between them. And also that the conflict risk from scarcity issues are very rarely going to be standalone drivers of conflict. Instead, they're going to be threat multipliers. So if you take examples like the post-election violence in Kenya in 2008 or the Rwandan genocide in 1994, you can see that competition for land was a factor in both cases, but it absolutely wasn't a standalone driver of conflict. It was part of a much more complicated web of factors. And I think another point that it's important to make about conflict risk is that when you have scarcity, the conflict risk that exists is often less about control of the resources themselves than about the livelihoods that those resources enable. So when people lose their livelihoods because of scarcity and become unemployed and lose food security, then the conflict risk goes up. And the obvious example of that is piracy off the coast of Somalia. These are communities that used to be fishing communities. Increasing depletion of those fisheries led to erosion of those livelihoods, and hence them having to look for alternative livelihoods. But the transboundary level does matter too. I am always shocked by the statistic that of the world's 263 transboundary river systems, 158 lack any kind of cooperative management framework. It's deeply sobering. Of course, we're seeing more competition for energy resources in multiple theaters all over the world, and increasingly, potentially, competition for land and food as well. I think one especially interesting dimension of conflict risk is the situation of seeing existing legal infrastructure come under increasing stress because of climate change. If you take many water sharing agreements, for example, you often find that countries' shares to water are expressed in litres, not in percentages. It's a recipe for disaster when flow rates start to fall and people are still wanting to see their full entitlement of litres. Or another really existing one is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, of course, gives countries territorial rights for 200 miles offshore from their coastlines. Now, what happens if those coastlines start to recede because sea levels are going up? At that point, you have existing border disputes, for instance, the one between the US and Cuba in the Gulf of Mexico, getting thrown into total confusion because it's not clear which coastline you're talking about, the previous one or the current one. And again, we haven't really begun to stress test existing legal infrastructure to look for these kind of instances. So let me move to conclude and say that this is by no means a comprehensive list that I've just set out, but I hope it gives some idea of the breadth of the challenges we're looking at. And I want to wrap up by touching very briefly on three cross-cutting themes that I think are central to how we approach these issues. The first is this whole question of integrated analysis. Now, we all know that our governments, international organizations, and institutions generally are hampered by stovepipes and silos and so on. And we need to overcome that, particularly on scarcity issues, given the feedback loops and the linkages that I've talked about. But I do think one mistake we keep making as we try and improve policy coherence is assume that the solution lies in some way with redrawing the organogram, creating new agencies, closing them down, merging them, and that kind of thing. And I think instead, perhaps we need to see the challenge as more creating shared awareness, common analysis, common sense of objectives among existing institutional configurations. I think we may find that we get better rates of return on that. A second cross-cutting theme is the whole issue of fairness, which I think is the gorilla in the room on scarcity issues. For me, the jury is still very much out on whether there are limits to growth per se as a result of resource scarcity. I'm not convinced of that yet, but I think it is clear that there are obviously limits to how much carbon we can put into the atmosphere, how much oil there is, how much land and water are available, and so on. Now, we can do a huge amount with efficiency and new technologies, but I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that efficiency and new technologies get us off the hook altogether from having to face up to the distributional questions, the questions of fair shares that arise in a world of limits. If we refuse to acknowledge that issue, then I think by default what we set ourselves up for is a slide into a zero-sum game, a world of resource nationalism and competition for resources. And if we want to go into the opposite state, a world of non-zero-sum cooperation, of joint approaches to shared challenges, then grasping that nettle on fairness is where we start that. And the most obvious instance where we need to do that is in the climate change context. We will not stabilize the climate until we figure out a way to share out a safe global emissions budget between 192 countries. And there's a politicized question for us to come to in the Q&A. Lastly, a word about political space, and I'll finish on this note. I think we need to be upfront about the fact that, for the most part, the political space to get serious about these issues is not yet open. But I think the political space will open. Often, I suggest, suddenly, and only briefly, in the immediate aftermath of shocks. Because after sudden onset crises, people are often, for a short time, prepared to think the unthinkable. Think about the aftermath of 9/11, or the aftermath of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, or of Katrina, the food price spike, oil at $147 a barrel. These create windows of opportunity. And I think in those windows of opportunity, everything depends on the ideas that are lying around. If potential solutions are sitting on the shelf, then potentially it's possible to secure agreement of them with surprising rapidity. But if, on the other hand, we haven't started thinking about solutions at the time that window of opportunity opens, then at best we lose the opportunity, and at worst we're into panic mode. Since we're in the Ronald Reagan building today, it seems appropriate to end by quoting Milton Friedman, writing to his fellow monetarists in the 1970s when they were still just a bunch of cranks in the wilderness who no one had ever heard of. He wrote to them, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." Now, I think that for those of us who work on scarcity issues, this should be our basic function too, to start thinking through what it would take to start making globalization more resilient and more sustainable in a world of scarcity. Because even if policymakers and publics aren't asking that question yet, I think we can reasonably suspect that they soon will be. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alex. Let's turn the floor over to Matt.
Thank you, Jeff, for inviting me, and it's always a pleasure, of course, to be here with Alex, and I must, commend him and his colleagues, David Stephen and Bruce Jones, and with whom we work very closely for really their path-breaking analysis. I was going to, in my portion, step back a little bit and look at what Alex has been describing in terms of how we are absorbing that analysis, deepening it, in some case dealing with it, both on an analytic level and then looking more broadly across government, and talking a little bit about the problems, including some of the stovepipes and issues, and thinking about how we want to develop maybe a roadmap together, which I see as kind of the purpose of the workshop. So to begin, I think, as I said, we have worked closely with Alex and David. We actually have a work coming out. It's kind of a mini global trends that we have been working with the European Union's Institute for Security Studies, and taking some of the analysis, particularly on these interrelated resource issues. I think the one area that is of particular interest for our analysis, and I would say within government particularly, is the links with the changes in the international system. Because the one thing that, and Alex touched on this a little bit, you are seeing this phenomenal change going on the resource side, but at the same time your international system is in great flux. Now, a lot of that is linked. Look at the rise of the middle class, and a lot of these areas are the ones who are the consumers of these resources, and that's why we have emerging new powers. And in that sense, it's a good news story. And even though it creates these challenges, in one perspective, we should see it that way. But on the other hand, it creates its own stresses in terms of the international system, and I'll get to this a little bit later, in terms of dealing with the issue because of the fact that the international system is in flux so much, as well as the governance system. So those issues, when we're looking at the scarcities, are interrelated with our thinking about these other changes. Now, I'll divide up, just for purposes here, kind of my thinking about how we're absorbing this analysis on an analytic level in the sort of work we do in the NIC, and even more broadly in how I see it being dealt with in think tanks versus on a broader government policy level. And I'll say up front, just to give you a bottom line, I'm much more comfortable with how we're beginning to absorb these findings, this sort of analysis at the analytic level. It seems to be a lot more problematic when you really look at the government and the policy level. And that's, I mean, what really worries me more, although I don't want to end on a huge sour note, so I'll give you some signs where I see some real improvement. But first on the analysis, I mean, if you compare Global Trends 2020 and Global Trends 2025, 2020 came out in 2004, Global Trends 2025 in 2008, you'll see a huge difference in terms of how we dealt with climate change, environment, and the resource issues. It really wasn't, we talk about climate change, we talk about some of the oil, so on, but it really wasn't there, certainly not in the integrated sense that Alex was just talking about. And I think there are, some reasons for that. One thing, we have to be frank and upfront that during the Bush administration, there wasn't a great emphasis within the intelligence community on looking at climate change and environmental issues. So we didn't, for example, for the Global Trends 2020 work, I can remember one or two conferences that we held on those issues. We moved much more into higher gear on the 2025, and a lot of these, when you're doing global trends, you're basing it on a lot of work that is behind the scenes that you don't see, and there was a lot of work that General Engels here had been doing on climate change, which we benefited from, and just a lot of, I think, events, developments that happened in those 4 years too that pushed our thinking along. But that is one of the factors, I would say, in our slow movement on this initially. The other is obviously on the stovepipes, and I don't think we need to go through that too much, except I'd like to focus on one thing that, and I think, Jeff, you wrote an article once on it, which is the divide between government and science, and I would say science and technology. And this is an issue where within government, we really don't have the capabilities to do the the real deep research and analysis. And we rely, as we did on the climate change study, on IPCC results, some commission work that we go to the academy. And I think we're, and I would say this too on the technology side, some issue that Alex didn't deal with as much, but one that I know in our next work on global trends we're very interested in looking at what are the possible technological breakthroughs, improvements that could deal with some of these scarcity issues, and hooking up what is going on in the labs, sometimes the national labs, and so on some of these issues. Now, when we do this, which we're finding out right now, we're engaged in developing a much more of a technological exchange. We find, there's only, the welcome mat is certainly put out. There's a real eagerness by a lot of technologists and scientists to really think about these problems and think about what are the needed moves in the next 10 to 15 years in order to sideline some of the scarcities and actually promote better growth. So that is an issue that is a perennial one. I think we're very aware of it in our work, but it is one that we really have to work at. And it is one that, as I remember, Jeff, in your articles, which was, I don't know how many years ago, but obviously is something that hasn't easily gone away, and one that I would commend to like think tanks and NGOs to think about ways of bringing the two communities together. Now, the final thing I will say on improvements side of it, and why I am very hopeful, is that with the global trends work and with other work that is going on within the U.S. intelligence community, and to a large extent I have a certain window through Alex and others into what's happening in the UK and now also somewhat in the EU. I think this synergy between think tanks, NGOs, which is probably most vibrant in Washington, is probably the reason why we are absorbing this at an analytic level in government. And there are quite a few Ellens sitting over there. We work closely on with the Stimson Center. Richard Sincata down there, is our demographer, and a lot of the findings that came out of the 2025 work were a result of working very closely with him for 2 or 3 years, understanding the relationship on the demography. And it's just not the climate change, but I would cite that demography in the near term as a hugely important issue when you're looking at these resource issues. So that cross-pollination that happens now increasingly on these issues has been essential, and I think will be essential as we go forward. Now, broadening this out a little bit to a government level and getting at this issue, okay, now you want to move to action in a sense, and where are we, and how well placed are we really to get to the next stage on policy making and decisive action. This one I think is a difficult nut to crack, and I don't see the formula yet. I think I've laid out with the other kind of a formula how we get there. This one is much more difficult, and there are a lot of reasons why I'm very cautious here and somewhat pessimistic. First is the stovepipe issue. This is where it's really entrenched, because it's not just within agencies, it's between agencies. And agencies have very vested interests. And in my experience, you're very dependent on senior leadership in order to get really decisive action. So things don't bubble up. You have somebody really at the top who raises some of these big issues, are seized by some of the analysis that, like what Alex was putting out, and really begins to crack heads and create a policy process. And I've observed this not only here, but in a lot of European governments. This seems to be the normal practice. And in order to get this process going, you really are reliant on somebody in a position of power. Unfortunately, they don't necessarily come at just the moment you want, or they're not that many of them. And the other thing is that you have to always understand that the tactical trumps the strategic. And you got multiple crises going on with any government, and fires they have to put out immediately. A lot of these issues, and by their very nature, they're ones that are long-range character, where now Alex listed several crises, the Katrinas and so on, and those are good in the sense that it brings these issues to mind. But in many cases, you don't necessarily have that. At the same time, you really need this long timeline in order to deal with the issues. So this is a huge problem. How do you prevent when you don't have the actual crisis at hand? And in my experience, there are more policymakers that are simply focused on the tactical, fewer that take these longer range perspectives. The other thing, and this gets back to a point I was making at the beginning on the changes in the international system, and I think Alex again touched on this at the end when he talks a little bit about the fairness issue. Now, in this study we did with the EU ISS, we went around the world and visited 7-8 countries, talked with officials and think tanks and so on about how they looked a lot on these issues, on the resource issues. There is certainly a feeling among emerging states that in large part this is seen as our problem in the West, one that we created, one that we should be cleaning up in a sense. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that analysis, but that is very much their reflex and instinct when they're thinking about it, and it is something that, in a sense, we are going to have to grapple with. And this gets to the point about the governing mechanisms, because for them there is still, before you even get to these issues, these problems, you have to think about the legitimacy issue. For them, they don't think of some of these institutions that Alex rattled off actually as very legitimate. They don't necessarily reflect their interests, their membership, where they should be in the hierarchy. Some of this has begun to change after the financial crisis. The G20, I think, is again a very hopeful development. But even there, where they would like to see the changes are actually in the UN, particularly the Security Council. For that is a symbol of coming to the high table. And for many of them, G20, and they were very explicit about that, isn't quite that. So that is something that in thinking about these issues and how to deal with them, we are going to have to think about. It's just not dealing with the issue itself. So let's turn, concluding to a little bit brighter side. Where do I see some bright spots? First is the fact that even though, as I was emphasizing, most policymakers are involved in the tactical side, we increasingly, and this is just, I don't think in the U.S., because I've countered this everywhere, a greater interest in strategic analysis. Now, it's not as if they always have the time, but we're increasingly within the intel community getting requests to think much more broader range. I know within, use the example of the British government, and Alex, I think you were associated with the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, another effort, again, to get above the fray a little bit. You now have within the EU set aside a certain amount of money to develop a planning cell, certainly with the new External Action Service, in addition to renewing the one within the Commission. They're interested in working with actually us on some of these global trends. When we're on our trip in China, you find that one of the reasons they like to meet and talk with us is that they feel they're even more stovepipe than we are. And you have now a think tank in China that is doing a global trends report, looking at trying to get over these stovepipes. So this is definitely coming up the agenda item all around the world, and it's not just in, you say, China is a much richer state. We had a group from South African government talking to us about the same way. How do you do this? How do you, can you help us on thinking out how you would do a global trends work for South Africa? I think within the U.S. government, I can say the planning offices particularly, and we have now under Ambassador Mary Yates and the National Security Council, regular meetings that rope in the planning offices, and they are very much seized with these resource issues. In fact, we have several seminars going on at this point on resource issues. I would commend particularly here to the military. We get some of our most, frequent requests, particularly on resource issues. Understanding that comes from military planning offices. QDR had a climate change scenario, this last one. So this is, people are thinking about these issues. We're getting increasingly, I'd say and this maybe goes to your point about it hasn't changed the wiring diagram, but you have a network now that is being developed, looking at these issues inside at least inside the USG. Finally, going back to a point, in terms of aggregating, integrating all this, and where I started with kind of global trends, which was, I think, very pivotal within the intelligence community and pulling these issues together, and just reiterate that now we have, because of in part because of our process of going out and talking about these issues, so much interest on so many governments' part of doing that sort of analysis. And I think, again, the NGOs, the think tanks have played such a big part in those countries as they have done in our country here. And creating those sort of networks and interrelationships, thinking here too of what we've helped with Stimson Center create networks within certain regions to think about these, to talk about these subjects. That is really been growing phenomenally. and something that I think, going back to what Alex was saying, how the necessary having the solutions, so when the crisis hits that you can get some actions on. I think we are doing that legwork, and it is so important, I think, too, for the NGO and think tank community to do that, because it is much easier, I think, than it is on the government-to-government level. I think we have been pretty fortunate. Doors open for us. There isn't the suspicion that even I thought there would. After all, we have intelligence in our name. But I think it is actually easier when you're talking on these fairness issues and thinking about practical solutions, that in some ways it is led by think tanks and NGOs. I'll stop there, and thank you again, Jeff and Alex.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Alex. You've given us a lot to work with, and I know from looking around the room, we have a lot of folks who've grappled with this as well. So I will turn it straight over for the conversation. And why doesn't Sean give David the microphone there? Just a reminder, if you could let us know who you are as you pose your question.
David Mickle with the Stimson Center. I'd like to leap in on this question of having ideas ready to go. If I could make a cynical reading of the window of opportunity that opened through the 9/11 crisis, one might say that the idea that was on the shelf was invading Iraq, and that was not necessarily a good idea or an appropriate solution. So I wonder whether we really do need to grapple more closely with not only the setup of the ideas on the shelf, but the crisis decision-making procedure, because often one might want to argue that the decisions one makes in a crisis are, due to that very pressure, are overreaching or alternatively insufficient, or are later on regretted. And particularly in the scarcity questions that you've so cogently raised of climate change, water resources, land resources, I would venture to say that another factor is the timing of the decision relative to the effectiveness of the solutions, by which I mean to say by the time that the crisis on the climate question, for instance, arises that shocks the world into taking decisions, it may actually be too late to really mitigate climate impacts or undertake appropriate adaptive actions. So there again, what the world decides to do at that point may be not only contentious, but maladaptive, so to speak. And if I were betting you, I would say that when the climate crisis arises, if it shocks the world into action, the solution the world will reach for will be geoengineering, precisely because of this timing question. When the shock is big enough to get the world to take action, people will throw up their hands and say, 450 parts per million, already passed, can't get there. Geoengineering, cheap. One power can do it, maybe a consortium of a few powers. That's what we're going to go for. So let's open the can of worms of what are the institutional arrangements through which these crisis decisions are going to be made, and are organizations like the WTO or the IEA or the UN legitimate to take those decisions?
You guys like to? There were a couple questions in there.
Well, actually, when you started your point, saying it's not necessarily good ideas that take advantage of moments of opportunity, I was going to come straight back and say, yes, many geoengineering companies are just waiting for such an opportunity. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it partly comes back to a point that Matt made in his presentation, that policymakers have such perverse incentives on risk management. When policymakers do successfully take proactive action, preventive action to manage a risk, not only do they not get rewarded for it, they occasionally get criticized for it. And the case in point is swine flu. Policymakers saw the risk coming up, took decisive action ahead of time, prevented it from becoming a pandemic, and hey presto, everyone criticizes them for overreacting, over-dramatizing the issue. And yet, conversely, when you do reach crisis moments, everyone wants to know why government didn't prevent it from happening in the first place. So crazy, crazy incentives. I mean, I think the only sort of comment I make is that on the climate change front, I don't think of it as just one crisis that creates the window of opportunity. I mean, I guess you're right. If we assume that it's going to take something as dramatic as an abrupt climate change scenario to create the political space, you may well be right that it's too late by that point. If the methane hydrates are bubbling up from the Atlantic seabed, then, we're into a whole other game by that stage. But I think I see it more as a sort of, succession of shocks, which, according to the IPCC, will increase in frequency and severity. I mean, of course, you could come straight back to me and say, but you've just had two, massive extreme weather events in Russia and Pakistan. Both governments have explicitly attributed those to climate change, and it hasn't changed the political conditions at all on the climate negotiations, which is true. So, I don't have an overall sort of complete answer to this. I think, we're still waiting for the political space to open, but I do, continue to think that after those impacts and sort of shocks and stresses, that's when the political space is there. And the fact that bad ideas can take advantage of those windows of opportunity, it seems to me all the more reason why we should try and develop good ideas to contest those windows of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I would just say one thing, that I think 9/11, I mean, obviously was a shock, but I think even more importantly, it was a surprise. So, I mean, Americans just did not think it could happen, or such a thing. And I guess I would say that in my mind, one of the reasons why you were laying down, and possibly if we'd done this more in terms of how we had been talking about terrorism beforehand, is to prepare people for the eventuality, and therefore they won't jump to maybe the wrong conclusions. And that is that's why we do lots of scenarios. That's why this analysis alone, to see how the risks compound and how they can, as with Kenya example, make things worse, so that in a sense you're prepared mentally for that shock, and hopefully in a better position to think about what kind of countermeasures you want to take. There's no, there's no magic recipe against bad decisions. I mean, that will happen, and in a sense, that's what we also need to prepare for. But on your example of geoengineering, I mean, it's incumbent upon us to begin thinking about what are the consequences if you do it, and talking about it so that people have an understanding at these crisis moments of what the risks are on both sides.
I would just also maybe add, in the post 9/11 situation, we did have rhetoric, whether it was at the Financing for Development Conference or some of what was coming out of Powell's State Department, where even the national security strategy of we're facing greater threats from failing states than invading states, that those ideas of addressing underlying grievances and underlying causes of poverty as a security policy were there. They just didn't win in terms of, or get the resources or get the follow-through that was necessary. So in part, some of those ideas were there. They just didn't win out. Other comments, questions? Yes, please, here, and then Alan. So, yeah, I'll come right down to you. So we'll get the two of them right there.
Hi, I'm Josh Meyer from Northwestern University. Matt, you had mentioned something about several times about the stovepiping that was going on, and some of your concerns about how the senior leadership wasn't engaged. I know that's not the case at the National Intelligence Council with General Engel here and other reports, but in the rest of the U.S. government, can you go into that a little bit in more detail, what some of the stovepiping was and where some of the log jams might have been? And also, you said that there's a network forming now to look at these issues. Can you walk us through that? I mean, did we lose 8 years in the Bush administration because of a reluctance to look into these issues?
Well, I mean, I think on the stovepipes, I mean, you're going to, you have a set of all these interrelated issues. You're obviously probably going to have stovepipes because, most organizations are set up, so that you break things down, usually by region, usually by function. If you have problems and challenges so large, so diverse, you're obviously always going to probably have the stovepipe issue. I think, in general, if you look across governments, and it's just not the U.S. one, I think there's this division between regional and functional that is difficult sometimes to actually overcome. And I think in these cases you actually do need regional experts, because going back to the Kenya example, you need people who understand how political events are going to play out, at the same time some understanding of the underlying resource issues, to really be able to forecast, to think about how things can play out and what are the various pressures. That is a perennial issue. It's one that we need to continually think about in terms of creating our own networks. And again, things like this are meant to, so you cross those boundaries. Now, we had, it's no secret during the Bush administration, climate change was not a high priority, and you have a system of you set out priorities, what policy interests are, and because it doesn't rise up on there, you're not going to have traction analytically for that. We nevertheless, in the NIC, we did the climate change NIA at the time, and because you are trying to think future about what are the critical issues.
Ellen Lapson, I was previously with the NIC, now the Stimson Center. I wanted to see if we could turn the integration question around, and this is a question for Alex, of what if the integration does happen first at the policy side and not at the analytic side? So I'm thinking of maybe counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan that has development, politics, security all wrapped into one. Or the case of in the British government, the FCO, DFID, and the MFO, and the MOD getting together on African peacekeeping, creating a fund. So there's a policy initiative that starts from some kind of integrated policy demand. Does that lead to better analysis? Does it lead to more integrated analysis? Do you see a demand for analysis that looks at these problem sets that cut across policy functions? So that's one question. For Matt, I was intrigued at your discussion about science and public policy, and I think you would agree that part of the problem is the business model in the United States changed, and that innovation in science doesn't necessarily happen because it's federally funded anymore. And I wonder if you found in your recent experience that when science is funded by the private sector, are there questions about the credibility, the legitimacy of the science findings? And does that affect how policymakers use those scientific findings?
Alex, you want to?
Yeah, great question. Difficult one to answer. I think in the UK there has been a big push over the last decade or so to try and improve the evidence base on which policy rests. And you can point to specific initiatives like the creation of the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in the Cabinet Office, or the Performance and Innovation Unit, as it was first called, which was absolutely designed to try and bring more evidence to bear. But I think it's often quite a difficult relationship. I think, for example, in the Foreign Office, I feel like the Foreign Office has for a long time really failed to capitalize on its extraordinarily rich network of research analysts, and to sort of capture their insights and really, embed them in the policy-making process. And it's partly, I suspect, because the timescales are different, that particularly at senior decision-maker levels, decisions are, taken very rapidly or responding to events as they happen. And research analysts are, often much more embedded in an academic timescale, but you can sit back and really look at a problem in the round. But my friend and colleague Nick Mabey has a lovely phrase on this, that the British civil service is this Rolls Royce of a machine, and senior decision makers get fed up, this sort of up the food chain, tremendously rich and gradually synthesized matrix of analysis, and then 4 people at the top read The Economist and take a decision. And I think that really captures what you're talking about. So, but I would love to hear what Matt says about this, because you've encountered it right up front.
Well, I mean, I actually think, there has been some progress that, these, as you encounter these problems, which are very complex, that increasingly that does drive the analysis. And we've seen it, I don't know, you'd have to go back and count, but I mean, I think, the number of, task forces and centers that are created, I mean, I think is testament to the fact that there is this, understanding that things are so interrelated and that there needs to be a way to get over the usual stovepipes. And I think, I think we're slightly better in the IC now about kind of getting out in front and kind of sensing when we need to move, and because the policymaker is going to come in with some questions. So in that sense, the fact that we anticipate it is driving some of this integration, which is good. On your question on the science, I don't have any sense that the credibility has gone down because of the business model changing. But Rich, I mean, you'd be in a better position because you see it more close hand than I.
But are they conducting research on the same questions that you would have them?
Part of their research is more technical than strategic from a business point of view. So one might say, well, are you missing out on the bigger strategic technical answers that you need to have to be able to really go look at it, that only government would inherently go do? That's a legitimate criticism, and I think that's certainly probably true. Since I have the microphone, can I ask you a question?
Please.
Good. Rich Engel from the NIC. It's a question really of analytical tradecraft, and I'd like both of you to take a look at this. When we look at certain resource types issues, we historically often start with a narrow view. We'll look at climate change. We'll look at water. We'll look at food. We'll look at energy. But the lens we often bounce those questions against is a lens that, for a simple way of describing it, it's just state stability. In other words, what will this factor due to state stability? And then the follow-on question is, what does that state stability mean to, typically in our case, U.S. security interests? Now, when we look at state stability, it is, as you alluded to, that's a broad question. Many things affect state stability, and so far our universal conclusions have been that none of the individual items I described are in and of themselves sources of instability. They work in tandem with other factors. I will say we also don't look at these items singularly. We know that when we look at climate change, it impacts water and food. When we look at food or water, we know they are in turn driven by climate change. But the real question is this: is the state stability lens a reasonable lens that we ought to be using? If not, what should we be using?
Another easy question for you.
Well, I think for my part, I do like the human security lens, and that there is an implicit critique there of the state-centric lens. I think also that looking at conflict trends since the end of the Cold War, I mean, of course, the decline in the number of civil wars has continued, but I think increasingly we're seeing that the number of deaths in conflict is rising again, and that's partly because of more conflicts at the subnational level, and partly because of conflicts that effectively ignore national borders, that are transboundary. So you think of conflicts driven by organized crime, like what's happening in Mexico at the moment. So I think in some ways the state as a unit of analysis, of course it would be incredibly rash to say it wasn't relevant. Obviously it's relevant in the security context, but I think that the kind of emerging security trends, and of course there's the increasing importance of non-state actors as insurgents and so forth, suggest we do need to look more broadly. So it's not that I have a problem with the security lens, but I think that pushing that then through the state security lens risks missing important parts of the puzzle.
I mean, I guess I would say for us particularly in the intelligence community, because you're working with policymakers. I mean, the state stability is the one that they relate to the most, and in a sense, you're trying to frame it, taking into consideration their mindset, so that you would continue along that way. I think, the bigger challenge in many ways is to understand how that state stability works, because you get into all of these different factors, and also I think the other big question that we encounter is just not what's going to happen to that state, but how does this spill over into the region? And that is something I think that we're not quite as good at, particularly when some of the, I'm thinking back to the Asian financial crisis. I mean, our understanding of how that would play out across the world was very, very minimal and fragmentary. I mean, and so in that sense, looking at it just at a state level, oftentimes, puts you off the bigger impact and the possible regional ramifications.
John, you have some hands back there that I can't see, and then we'll come and get these down here in the middle, and then over to Brian. Rich in the back, I see you. And I can get a list going here. Good.
Jonathan Stevens with the Burrows Foundation. Thank you, Jeff, and the Wilson Center for hosting this. My question is to both panelists, but primarily to Alex, because I'm going to go back to something you said in the very beginning of your talk. One of the first things you said was the importance of grouping scarcity, grouping the different aspects of scarcity. We at the Foundation are doing some research on natural resources in particular, and we're actually having a lot of trouble with that concept. A bit of a civil war broke out among the team that we recruited for natural resources, because we had the water people over here saying this was where you should focus. We had the oil and gas, again, oil and water don't mix, over here saying that that's where we should focus. And they said there was enough of a difference that grouping them into one chapter or one area of resource scarcity shortened the ability to look at them both for their unique properties. We're finding that they don't agree on the level of importance of each of the two. So my question to you is sort of, what challenges do you find when grouping resource scarcity? When you group things as diverse as land, water, oil and gas, whatever, does that miss out on some of the unique challenges that each of those particular resources pose in terms of scarcity?
Yes, it does.
Jonathan, if you could pass it over to Lauren in the middle, then we'll be ready for the next one. Right there. Yep. Yep. Okay, we got it. Good. Sorry. Go ahead. That's right.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Of course, at any level of aggregation, you are going to lose some of the granularity. That's just part and parcel of it. I mean, for me, there's two things here. I mean, I think partly I like looking at them as a set. I mean, I didn't touch on this, but I think also it does focus on the property rights issue, which particularly for land and water, I think is especially important. And it brings the fairness issue implicitly to center stage, and I like that about it. But I guess the real reason why I started sort of thinking about these issues as scarcity issues is because it felt like there was a problem in how we framed these issues. I mean, I did my master's degree in environmental science. I think environment as a frame is very problematic for getting to grips with these issues. It sort of excludes people, it excludes development concerns, it sort of takes you straight into an epistemic community that, in political terms, doesn't always have the clout to deliver on what it wants, and you just have to look at the history of environmental treaties and environmental summits to see the evidence of that. But equally, I'm not a huge fan of sustainable development as an integrative concept. I mean, I like the fact that it was an attempt to connect the dots to come up with some holistic way of looking at it, but I think the term has ended up meaning all things to all people. Now, I am not ideological about using scarcity as a frame. I can absolutely see the problems with it. You've just highlighted one. I think another one you could easily say is, what about situations where the problem is abundance rather than scarcity? I mean, if you're in Pakistan right now, the problem with water is not a lack of water, it's too much of it, and that's a legitimate criticism too. I mean, I'm completely open to a better way of framing these issues. I do think there are important interconnections between them, as I said, that are badly taken account of in policy processes, and we need to improve how we do that. So in a sense, I'm not saying that there aren't differences. Of course there are. I'm saying we do need to take more account of the linkages, and that's what this concept and narrative, if you like, is designed to do. But I would, I'm absolutely ready to shift to a different narrative if there's one that captures that better.
Hi, Lauren Labovich with the Council on Environmental Quality. Thanks, Alex and Matt. Those were great presentations. Two questions or topics that I thought I'd raise that before about 25 seconds ago I hadn't heard you talk about. One was going to be communication strategy, and I think building off the discussion around having the political space to make decisions and assuring that when we get that space we make the right decisions. I think it's important to talk about how to make sure we have an informed public and constituency, because that's part of what I think enables us not only to have the space to make decisions, but to make the right ones. And so you just started talking about that, how we frame it, but I think we're really good about talking about all this amongst ourselves. But I think, arguably we've lost the ability to talk effectively with the general public. At least climate change, I think, is a hard issue right now. So, Alex, you just talked about that, but that was one question. And then separate, but I think related, is on, framing this stuff in economic and financial terms. You hear a lot about big numbers on the cost side, trillions, billions, and all this kind of stuff. But I think part of what, helps to resonate with the public and people outside our, the academia and the expertise community is framing this stuff in economic terms and understanding, okay, it's going to cost us trillions of dollars to deal with this, but what's the benefit? What's the return? And I just, thought I'd, get some reaction from you guys on where the good work on that question is being done.
Well, I think that's one of the, obviously the strategic communications is a huge issue, and I don't think there's any pat answer that you can provide. I do think, that's where those outside government are probably in a better place, since we tend to be looking at how, government thinking, and there's certain also rules about how much we can disclose of what we're working on, and particularly on the classified side. So it's very important, again, to that NGOs be out there, the think tanks be out there. I can think of a way, if you think back to the Stern report, there was a lot on numbers in there, and costs, and in some ways it triggered an argument in this country, I think through James Tobin, that in some ways discredited the report and obscured really what were some wonderful findings. So you have to be very careful when you do that analysis, that you're not exaggerating or don't seem to be exaggerating the costs. And I think inevitably you're going to attract a lot of criticism, and it's also very difficult to do some of that calculation. On a separate subject, we've been doing a study where we did on transnational organized crime and try to get some of the, policymakers pushing you to talk about the costs of that. It's virtually impossible to get very good figures on it. And in some ways, when you're trying to cost this out, you're talking about scenarios, hypothesis, all sorts of contingencies that make it difficult to come up with a pat answer.
I agree very much that governments and policymakers have not got the narrative right on these issues. My colleague David Stephen and I did a report back in 2007 called Climate Change, the State of the Debate. One of the things we observed, and we weren't the first to do so, of course, was the disconnect between the narrative about the problem of climate change and the narrative about the solution. So policymakers basically say, this is the most serious issue facing the world today. It's a massive challenge to our children's future. So please don't forget to switch off the lights when you leave the room. And there's just this huge disconnect between the scale of the problem and then what people are asked to do as solutions. And people aren't stupid. They either figure that the problem's being exaggerated or that the solutions mooted are so manifestly incommensurate with the scale of the challenge that, we're probably all doomed. So, I think policymakers have to get better at this. But then there's an underlying question of, are policymakers actually the people that anyone looks to, if you like, sort of talk about the really big narratives about where we're going, as a civilization, ultimately. And I think there's a problem there that, 50 years ago, there were people whose job in our society was to talk about, these very large themes. We would look to faith leaders to do it, for instance. Now we're a much more secular society, and they don't fulfill that role. Policymakers have become more short-term as they've had to deal with a 24-hour news cycle. Trust in institutions has fallen. The media, I think, has basically, gone largely feral on these issues. That is always looking for the sort of, we saw this absolutely at Copenhagen, where even The Guardian, which is supposed to be a pro-global deal newspaper, just couldn't resist the, sensational story that the West was trying to stitch up the emerging economies, which actually was a, massively damaging moment in the summit when they leaked a Danish text, which was, out of date anyway. So, the underlying issue is who is it who's going to spin the sort of larger narratives about, stories about transition to kind of new stable states. And I think that's very unclear. Maybe social networking technologies is part of the answer, but it's too early to say how.
Okay. I think Rich in the back, Brian, and this gentleman right here in the front.
Richard Sincata, and I work for the for the National Intelligence Council at times and for the Environmental Change and Security Project, and I reside at the Stimson Center. Thank you, first of all, to the speakers for a wonderful, engaging talk and question session, and also to Rich Engel, who brought up an excellent question I don't want to let die, actually, which was about the difference, sort of implicitly about the differences between looking at state stability or state security and human security, which was brought up by one of the speakers. It's a question that bubbles around outside this room, but it very often gets muddled inside when we're talking, when speakers talk and come and give a presentation. One example is the debate on the security implications of HIV/AIDS, which is an immense human security problem, but in the long run did not turn out to be the national security issue that people projected that it would, or indicated that it would. And there's a whole long list of those. And I wonder, if we should be more explicit about which tack we're taking, because there's been a continual attempt to sort of muddle, sometimes purposeful, sometimes not, because people are not aware, but to sort of muddle the boundaries between human security and state security. That is, that every human security issue, just because people are in danger of losing their livelihoods and et cetera, automatically become threatening to the state. And we know just that isn't the case, because many states survive by marginalizing people. That's part of what they do. And my question is, in what you've indicated today, the agenda that you've laid out today, are we in danger of that? You yourself suggest that that human security is the lens from which you look, yet we know from our experience that governments are much more likely to rise to the task when they see state security or the international system being upset in a way that endangers their own well-being. Not necessarily those of the people out in the street or the people in the rainforest or wherever they are. Why are we in danger of sort of in this integrated approach, integrating all the human security concerns and just assuming that they are state security, without, once you lose that state security lens, you lose the handle upon which you can call attention to a problem and expect at least some kind of attention from policymakers.
Well, I think you're right. They are not, they don't overlap perfectly, but I don't think it should be an either-or. I mean, it seems to me you can use both lenses, and part of the value of using both is that each of them can flag up issues that are of concern that the other one might miss. I mean, if you take, I don't know, the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, that did not in any way present an existential threat to the Ugandan state. So you might have said, well, you know, from a state security perspective, we're not going to worry too much. But I think the international community did worry about it from a human security perspective. I think, A, that was important and legitimate and the right thing to do in its own right. And B, actually, it meant that when that conflict went transboundary and started spilling over into the DRC, the international community was already tracking it. So I think these are two useful and complementary lenses, and we shouldn't see human security as a lens as in any way being a threat to an ongoing emphasis on the importance of the state security lens.
I guess two comments. I mean, I take your point and agree that there's a tendency, certainly within the U.S. government, when you're looking at these issues, to immediately cast it in this national security frame. And there's some good reason for it. I mean, that's a way that you get much more of attention on it. But first thing is, I do think our notion of national security has grown. And if you look at, and this is why now climate change is in the QDR scenarios. I mean, military has an idea that they may have to intervene if it's a tsunami, if it's a humanitarian situation where it isn't particularly threatening to U.S. National security interests, but yet the public sees this as a security issue in the terms of, with the tsunami, again, it was, well, this is a way that the U.S. can recoup some of its standing in a region where, anti-Americanism had grown. I mean, so that's very soft concepts, but yet I think there is something there. I can remember back in the first Bush administration on the intervention in Somalia, which was really triggered by a whole bunch of CNN reporting, and suddenly that was seen as a security issue. And so I do think that this issue on security itself is elastic and has been growing, and that and probably influenced by thinking on human security. And in that sense, you have to, when you're doing these studies, you have to think about how this concept security has been broadened, and it's not just an idea to make sure it gets to the policymakers, the top of his pile necessarily, but also thinking about how in the public mind security has grown.
Brian?
Thank you. And thank you both for your fascinating presentations. Alex, got a couple quick points I wanted to ask you about. You suggested that there is a fairness gorilla in the room that has to do with how we approach development. And I wanted to suggest that there may also be a ghost in the room, which would be the ghost of Julian Simon, which I was heartened to hear you apparently cast out in the early going when you suggested that scarcity really needed to be a primary optic for us rather than cornucopian economics, and that technology and efficiency weren't going to get us to inexhaustible resource supplies, and that substitutability runs into problems of basic physics and chemistry, so that we can't simply consume the world around us and wish it were something other than what it is. And yet, if I understood you correctly, you reached the conclusion that scarcity in combination with limits don't raise fundamental implications for the prospects for endless economic growth. And I wonder if you could tell me where I go astray in reaching somewhat different conclusions about how long the juggernaut cannot just continue as it is, creating massive environmental externalities, but simply finding the basic resources that it needs for the commodity base. So where do I go wrong in reaching a different conclusion? And secondly, you suggested that one of the things that we need to do, and I completely agree, in terms of improved management and governance of renewable natural resources was to begin at the developing country level, because that's where the vulnerable people are, the most vulnerable people are, and of course that's true. But on the same logic that we bring to bear in climate management, where we need to bring in the largest emitters in order to get a handle on the issue, what is the rationale for not beginning with the countries that have the largest consumption footprint and ecological footprint in a globalized economy where they can draw resources in with largely unregulated production systems in developing countries, causing many of the problems that we see? How do we suggest improved governments at, if you will, at the periphery, and not begin by calling attention to the responsibility of the core and its consumption patterns?
Okay. That wasn't the question I thought you were going to ask. When you said Julian Simon, I thought you were about to accuse me of being a sort of, Malthusian sort of hair-shirted character. And, to which I would have replied that, Malthusians are determinist. I'm not. I'm neither Malthusian nor cornucopian. I think, we have choices ahead, and we need to take those decisions consciously and on the basis of the evidence. I mean, on the question of limits to growth, the reason I think the jury is still out on this is that although you can't point to any country in the world today that has completely decoupled economic growth from ecological impacts and from material consumption, it just doesn't, I don't see why you can't have indefinite growth in the services sector. I'm not saying anyone's doing that at the moment, but for instance, when I do freelance consulting, if I do, 10% more freelance papers next year than I did this year, that's economic growth, but it really doesn't come with enhanced material impact. I haven't had to buy an additional computer. My electricity usage hasn't really gone up because the computer's on, anyway. I mean, I'm sort of slightly reducing it to the level of the absurd, but it just seems to me that, in particular, if we start by putting the question of are there limits to growth on the table, you're starting with the most difficult issue. And even those members of the sustainable development community who've really thought about this haven't really bottomed it out that far. There's a guy called Tim Jackson in the United Kingdom who just read a book called Prosperity Without Growth. Very, very cogent exploration of the idea of limits to growth. He doesn't get at all into the question of what happens to the financial system. If you have limits to growth, then you can't have lending at interest. I mean, that's a massive implication, and it's not really unpacked in his book. So it seems to me the sustainable development community isn't actually ready to have this conversation, with the wider world. It needs to sort of go through all of the implications before it starts trying to initiate this conversation. And also, I just feel in terms of framing it, as I say, it starts with the most difficult issue. It's going to get us into very sort of contentious discussions, which I think, we don't have to start with. At the same time, I didn't in any way mean in my presentation, starting with the developing country stuff, to suggest that we should do that first and only then turn to the other things. I think these are all tracks that we have to pursue in parallel, and that's why, I took care to say that, I think the gorilla in the room, the really big issue here is sharing out the carbon budget. There is no way you get to, sustainable outcomes on land, food, energy, water without a global deal on climate change, and we don't get to do that without facing up to the equity issues. So, you're absolutely right. Of course, it's people in OECD countries that have the big environmental footprints. That's where we're going to solve this issue there and, in the global middle class more broadly. So I didn't in any way mean to suggest that was a task for later.
Okay. Gentleman's been very patient down here in the middle. And then I see one in the back. Is that Alan and then Bob? Katie? We've got lots of... I think given our time, why don't we... right down here in the front. Sorry, Sean. Why don't we collect those, I think it was 4, and then give you guys a chance to respond, make sure everyone gets their question in.
I'm Hugh Haskell from the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. It's obvious from all the questions and the discussions that have been going on today that the main issue that we're faced with is the complexity of these problems. And that is not just the interchange between the so-called stovepipes, but within the stovepipes. Climate change, for instance, is an incredibly complex system, as so are all the others that we've talked about. And one of the ways that's been dealt with, at least in the climate change and a couple of the other areas, is computer modeling to try to figure out what's going on. Trying to model the interactions and the feedback loops between these various stovepipes is an order of magnitude more difficult. And I don't know what is being done in that area, but perhaps you could throw some light on, is there any kind of work in that arena going on to try to deal with these complexities and try to figure out how to make predictions from these models, which are going to be very difficult to historically verify.
Predictions about climate.
Predictions about what's going to go on, how the interactions are going to affect what we do and what happens to us.
Okay, terrific. Alan, if you could throw yours into the mix.
Hi, Alan Wright with Hassett Willis & Company. My question actually stems from, it's kind of the flip side of what Lauren asked earlier, and it's communicating within government organizations up to senior leaders. And it's dealing with that problem of tactical always trumps strategic. So how do you get from all of these complex questions, how do you get leaders that are typically equipped and have structures that are built to respond to, direct acute events, and get them to start thinking about complex, indirect, and long-term trends?
Okay. And then, Kayla, if you could bring it down here for Kathleen and Bob, we'll get those two and then give our panels last chance.
I don't know. I don't like to pile on. I don't handle a lot of questions myself when I'm presenting, so maybe I'll just try to be brief. But I want to thank Brian for what he asked, because it was exactly the direction I wanted to go. I'm a little disappointed, frankly, because I feel that you're much further down the track toward, if not determinism, at least Malthusianism, than you are willing to recognize. And the potentially radical message that you're presenting has been watered down by, I think, too high level and elite a sort of discussion about the policy implications. Where you're headed with the idea of scarcity and how it links so many issues is towards a fundamental recognition that the scale of the human enterprise is really at issue here. We are not capable of indefinitely increasing the scale of our activity, particularly in regard to natural resources, and certainly in regard to our use of the atmosphere. And that if you explore that, and if you develop that narrative, that this is fundamentally an issue of scale and how we share as human beings a limited set of natural resources, which is called the planet Earth, unless we plan to get into space, is really a critical issue, and one that the public does need to be engaged in. And I disagree with Mr. Burrows here that this is something for NGOs to take to the public. This is something for leadership. This is something for people who understand these issues to be brave in, to be courageous in, and to stand up and take to the public and try to convey to the public, as they are being misled by the Glenn Becks and the oil and gas interests of the world, why the world is not quite as simple as they're being told it is, but does relate to these limitations. And I think, there are several very, very specific policy angles that aren't about whether economic growth itself can continue indefinitely, are very much about whether resource growth can continue indefinitely, are very much about population. One of the real issues about population, for example, is whether developed countries should be stimulating their own population growth, as many countries in Europe are doing and as Japan is doing. I was disappointed to see, Jeff, and I know you don't take any responsibility for this, just thumbing through your Asia program's reports, that there was recently a report on Japan. Japan's population decline, obviously a problem, but what are the solutions? Why is Japan's population decline a problem when we are dealing with a world in which the wealthy are clearly consuming their way to a point where there isn't room for the unwealthy to develop. And I think a little bit more courage around sort of these upper policy echelons about the real implications for demographic change in developed as well as developing countries, and certainly for consumption, if not consumption generally, at least consumption of fossil fuels and natural resources would be welcome. This is something that the public is not incapable of understanding, but it needs much more courage and it needs much more leadership from analysts who do understand it.
Thank you. I'm Kathleen Mogelgard. I'm from Population Action International. And my question revolves around, I wondered if both of the speakers may be able to comment on some practical near-term actions we could be taking. I'm particularly interested in the new UN High-Level Panel on Global Sustainability and what that group will be doing leading into the Earth Summit in 2012. And if this perhaps provides some of those kinds of opportunities for the kinds of leadership that Bob was just talking about, or other ways that those of us in the room, whether we represent government or the NGO sector, ways that we might be able to use these institutions as an opportunity for some, if there's going to be political space that would be created by this new high-level panel and the activities leading into the summit. I would love to hear any practical suggestions from you both on ways that you think that we could capitalize on that opportunity.
Okay, unfortunately for time, we're going to have to cut it off there, give Matt and Alex an opportunity to make some final comments.
Well, computer modeling first, I mean, has a long association with these issues. You go back to the sort of 1970s, and of course the original Club of Rome analysis that set out limits to growth first time round was very much the work of systems modelers. I think in the climate context now, it's interesting because, of course, computer capacity has moved so much further forward. So you look at climate models now, they are so much more sophisticated. You know, the ocean-atmosphere coupling is handled much better and so forth than it was even just a few years ago. But you still have such massive uncertainties involved that I think it's always going to be difficult to use them as straight-up forecasting tools. I think, you know, that's why the IPCC has always gone for a scenario-based approach. We're never going to eliminate that uncertainty, and hence we need a more kind of risk management-based approach to the policy, I think. The question on communicating to senior leaders, I mean, I think it is partly just dependent on the leaders themselves, and you get moments of opportunity that arise because the right person comes along. I was part of the kind of cross-Whitehall team that helped to put together the G8 that the UK chaired in 2005, and it was fascinating seeing Tony Blair wanting to do something really radical and dramatic on climate change, and then constantly getting frustrated by the kind of advice that was put up to him. No one could quite believe that he wanted to be this radical, and so you know, punches were quite often pulled. And I think it threw up really interesting questions about process. I think, you know, for me, an underlying issue is that often the kind of issues we've been talking about today have been captured in international policy circles by sort of technocratic priesthoods, if you like, that control how those issues are framed. Success is always just around the corner, an incremental approach is always the correct approach. And they sort of don't really explore the links between these risks and other risks. And so I think, you know, that there is a big question there about, as heads of government get increasingly engaged on issues like climate change, rather than leaving it to environment ministers, what are the processes they need to support them in that, and to bring, you know, the fusion of the right evidence base, but also the kind of political judgment that heads are especially well placed to exercise. Kathleen's question on the high-level panel on global sustainability, I agree with you. I think this is a huge opportunity, a really interesting one. Very difficult to say at this stage what the panel is going to come out with. Their first meeting, as you know, is on the 19th of September, just before the Millennium Development Goal Summit starts in New York. But I think looking at the people on the panel, this is, you know, there have been a lot of high-level blue ribbon commissions in recent years, but this is one of the ones with, I think, you know, one of the most impressive members lineups that I've seen. So it's all to play for, but I would really love to see that panel pushing forward some of the ideas I set out in the presentation. But well, I would say that. Finally, the question about kind of, you know, was I pulling my punches? Did I need to be a bit more courageous on limits to growth and so forth? I mean, I think this is a sort of, it's a moving target. Political space, you know, there's the political space that opens up suddenly in the aftermath of shocks. And then there's slowly, you know, what you can get away with talking about publicly. 15 years ago, climate change was still quite an edgy topic to talk about in a context like this, a sort of, you know, policy community seminar. I think it's only been okay, in inverted commas, to talk about peak oil for about 12 months. I think during the oil price spike, that issue shifted through to mainstream consciousness. The International Energy Agency started talking about it, and at that point, a little bit more political space opened up. But as I say, I mean, I think on the limits to growth, you said, resource growth, and I think that's absolutely the point here. I mean, if you say limits to economic growth per se, you're straight away, pitching your tent on the most difficult, contentious part of the ground. And in any case, I'm not sure the evidence is, as I say, I think the jury is still out on that. Where I 100% agree with you, and I said this in the presentation, is limits to the growth of some resources. And I specifically, said oil is finite, carbon space is finite, land is finite, and so forth. I think I wouldn't accept the argument that I sort of pulled my punches on it. I mean, I think, I put the issue of carbon space and the equity issues involved in that squarely on the table. If you want me to go a step further, I think the only way we'll ever get agreement between countries on how to share that is by agreeing to converge to equal per capita entitlements to the atmosphere by some date in the future. I've been arguing that for 10 years. You can find lots of stuff I've written about it on the web. But, beyond that, I mean, I think it is important how we frame these issues. And I think, I'm not accusing you of this, but there are lots of people who enjoy couching these issues in quite apocalyptic terms. Plenty of people, particularly in the peak oil community, collapsitarians, if you like. There's lots of other people who, love to see this in very local terms. Think that we're all heading for sort of, autonomous communities, which will be sort of food self-sufficient and so on. And, I very much think that the only way we're going to navigate these issues is through globalization. I can't see how we feed a world of 9 billion people without globalization, but we need to make it more resilient, more sustainable, more equitable, which brings us to international institutions. And so, I think that's where it goes. But I think couching it in those terms opens up the possibility of a more constructive dialogue than necessarily starting with the sort of, saying limits to growth, that's it, case closed. Because I think it's going to take time to unpack that debate.
Just, 2 points. One on, how within the government do you actually push these strategic, when you got all these tactical issues that are taking everybody's attention away. My experience, what you do need is an office that is devoted to those strategic issues, even though, they roam across the whole array of regional or functional issues. Unless you have a kind of a focal point, and this goes also in the analytic community, you're not going to really ever hope to get up on the agenda. I mean, even there, I think if you talked with people, for example, who've manned the Strategic Advisors Office over the years of the NSC, they will always say it's been a struggle. But they have, because that is their job, they have found a way. And then I think there has been devices that have been developed, and I think now the UK government is adopting one, and that is on developing national strategies, which immediately mean that the bureaucracy actually has to get involved in thinking about long term. And the fact that they're public, sometimes they're watered down, sometimes they're a little bit bland, but I think in terms actually of getting governments together and getting leaders focused on it, that's another opportunity. QDR, I think, in the military sense, is equally a time when you begin to try to think long term. So thinking of those devices, I mean, that's what we spend a lot of our time within government, I think, is particularly those working on the strategic side, is kind of poised, you would say, in a very unflattering way, although I think they also serve very constructive purposes, getting together and doing these longer papers, but also, serve to get the policymakers' attention. Now, on the question, I didn't mean to say that the politicians are supposed to be ducking, talking about the big issues. I agree with Alex that, there is only so much space there, and that NGOs, media, others serve very valuable purposes in, one thing, continuing the conversation and also enriching the conversation. And I think that, and as well as prompting more high-level pronouncements and leadership on it. And for my money, I mean, I think that really impetus and so on is the and triggering function of the NGOs, think tanks, and others is really the vital thing, and the one that's going to really, in a sense, get us closer to where we want to be. Relying just on the politicians, and maybe that's being a little cynical, is not going to get you there. So.
Well, I want to thank Alex and Matt and thank all of you for some excellent questions and discussion on what is obviously complex, as we heard, a complex set of issues, but one that I think we heard some pretty compelling cases for why they have to be treated together and can't remain in their stovepipes. Not that it's easy and not that the solutions are clear, but nevertheless worth pushing it further along the path. So please join me in thanking our guests for today's discussion.